Glanced out the window. He saw something that totally surprised him, and he couldn't believe what he saw. As he glanced up on the mountain about 3/4 of the way up, he saw a light. There was a light that was flickering. That night the wind was blowing because the curtains in the bedroom were moving slightly, and surely up on the mountain the trees were moving and the limbs gently. And as they moved, they made the light look like it twinkled or flickered. Then all of a sudden it went out. Charlie began to think to himself because he remembered that his dad had told him nobody lives up on Shadow Mountain. It's deserted. That's why you got to be so careful. But where did that light come from? Charlie began to think and finally sort of drifted off to sleep. As he slept, he began to dream about the mountain. But then he was woken with a startling noise that he hadn't heard in a long, long time, and that was a rooster out in the yard crowing. And for a moment, Charlie had to figure out, where in the world am I? And then as he looked out the window and he saw Shadow Mountain, he remembered he was at his grandpa's farm, and he went over to the bed of the boys, Preston and Red, and shook them and said, get up, I've got something to tell you. And he began to tell him what he saw the night before about the light up on the mountain. But he said, we've got to do this. Let's not tell Grandpa, because if we tell Grandpa, he might not let us go up on the mountain today. So the boys got dressed, ran down the stairs, along the long hallway, finally to the kitchen. As they walked in the kitchen, and there in the kitchen, see, Shug had gotten a new table for Christmas. And this table was red on top, and it was chrome around the edges. And it had 6 chairs, and those chairs were chrome with red cushions on them. And she just adored it. She had seen it in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and she just had to have it. And that Christmas, Grandpa gave it to her. And on that table, she had a breakfast that you would not believe spread out. She had a big platter of her homemade fluffy buttermilk pancakes. And they were just steaming pancakes. Next to them was some homemade butter with some homemade syrup. Now, just that morning, Grandpa had already been out and collected some eggs. And she had some eggs scrambled and ready, and some country fried ham. Cold orange juice, and a big tall glass of milk courtesy of Rosebud. What a delicious breakfast. The boys ate, and they talked about their day, and they told Grandpa they were going to go up Shadow Mountain. And they said, I want to remind you boys, be careful as you go up the mountain. And they said, yes, Grandpa, we'll be careful. And as they got up and cleaned up the dishes and put everything away, Shug had already prepared 3 bags for lunch. Each one of the boys got a bag, and off they went to their adventure. They had their hats, they had their canteens, and they had their little bag lunch put in their little backpack, and off they went across the field, past the gate of the fence that kept the cows in, and then they came to a pond. And they stopped for a moment at the pond, because in this pond, all night long the night before, they heard big, deep voices of some frogs. And they said, let's see if we can find one. And so they went over to the edge, and there one was. Preston reached down and grabbed it. Preston's pretty quick. He played baseball, so he played third base. And third basemen have to be quick, and he was quick. And he grabbed that frog and had it in his hand. He opened his hand, but before he knew it, that frog jumped up right on top of his head. Plopped right on his head. And he was trying to shake it off, but the frog wouldn't let go. And finally, it jumped back into the pond. The boys laughed and said, hey, let's not play around anymore. We better go. So off they went. And the closer they got to the mountain, something interesting they saw. Red said, you know what? I thought that mountain was not really that big, but the closer we get to it, the bigger it gets. And they said, look at all the trees. And look at how big the branches are and how they're overgrown. It looks kind of scary. And Charlie said, don't worry, guys, let's go. We're going to have a great adventure. So when they got to the edge of the tree line, he says, now we're going to have to do this. There's not a trail that leads up to the top of the mountain, so we're going to have to make our own like pioneers would. So off they went, scurrying up the mountain. All of a sudden they'd hear something over the bushes, and they'd see a squirrel kind of chattering and walking around, and they'd stop for a moment and watch and listen. And then as they walked a little bit further, they saw an interesting old log with moss and stuff on it. And they'd roll it just a little bit and look underneath, and they'd see a long centipede with 100 and something legs come by. And as they went on up the mountain, they'd heard a bird sing, and they'd try to make the same sound, but they didn't do very well, and the bird would simply fly away, and it was gone. Well, by now, they were about 2/3 of the way up the mountain. It was getting close to noon, and they said, let's stop and eat. And they did. They opened up the lunches that Shug had fixed for them, and inside there was a peanut butter and blackberry jam sandwich. I mean, it had peanut butter in it and blackberry jam. Not just a little dab, but it just oozed out and fell on your leg when you ate it. They had an apple and a little bit to drink in their canteens. And as they lay there, they began to think, man, this is the life. We could just stay here all the time. They leaned back in the leaves and they kind of crunched under them, and they smelt good, and it was just still kind of cool. And as they leaned back and said, you know what? We better get started again. Preston looked up. Now, Preston was one of these guys that always thought about things, planned things out, had details. In fact, he had a compass with him that day because he wasn't going to get lost. So in that compass, he had the ability to know which direction they'd been going all day long. And as he was looking around, he glanced over his shoulder and he saw something. It looked like, he looked a little closer, and it was actually a path. And they walked up, they had stopped to eat lunch just before they'd get to this path. And so they walked a little further, and there on the path, they could tell that it had been worn. They began to think, who would have done that? Said, would it have been an animal, a deer? Well, they weren't quite sure. Or does that have anything to do with that light we saw? Well, the boy says, hey, let's hurry, because we got to get up to the mountain. It's already getting afternoon. We better get back as soon as we can to the farm. So the boys began to walk up the path, and as they walked up the path, there was a tree ahead. And it was an interesting tree. It came up, it was a locust tree, and it came up the trunk, and as it 5 feet off the ground, it had 2 big branches that just came off like that and went on up, stretched on up and up. And inside that little hole area, that kind of area that was right there, there was a bag, a little brown bag. The boys hurried up there and they looked. Charlie reached out and grabbed it, and he began to open it up. And it had a string tied around it, so it wasn't easily opened. So he had to untie the string. And as he opened up, he pulled out the carving. It was a carving out of wood of a deer. And it was carved by somebody that knew what they were doing. The legs, the hoofs, and the muscles, and the head, they were all perfect. And they began to think, who left this there? How did that get there? They began to think more and more. There must be somebody up here. But they began to think about the light again they'd seen. And they began to think about how late it was. And they say, what should we do with it? Charlie said. And they said, Red said, well, let's take it back and show your grandpa, and maybe he has an answer. Preston says, well, maybe we better not. Maybe someone will come back and they have left it here on purpose. Well, Charlie agreed with Red and said, let's take it back and ask Grandpa. So off the trail they continued, on up. And they came to a little place, 3/4 of the way up, which was called Shadow Ledge. And what it was an area of about 100 feet. And Charlie's dad had told him about it, that during the summer when he was a boy, he would climb up there and they'd play games on this ledge. They had grass there. But as they walked the path and came up to Shadow Ledge, they looked off to the right. In the trees, somewhat overgrown, was a shack made out of old barn wood and scrap wood, with a small porch on it, and a door that kind of leaned. They weren't quite sure what that was. They began to walk a little closer, and they almost got to the front steps when the door just flung open. And standing in that door, not just standing in that door, but filling up that door, was the biggest guy they had ever seen in their life. This guy stood about 6'5". He had broad shoulders. He was dressed in a red and black checkered flannel shirt. He had blue jeans rolled up to his knees with big lumberjack boots laced all the way up just below his kneecap. He had suspenders, a big heavy black beard, and he looked at those boys and he said, with a voice that seemed to thunder, "Get out of here!" Well, it didn't take the boys long. They got the idea they were not supposed to be there, and they didn't waste any time. They turned and ran as fast as they could down the path, past the tree where they had found the little package. And they knew about there that was the time to turn, and they turned and started running down the side of the mountain. And they ran down the side of the mountains. Limbs were hitting them on the arms, hitting them on the face. They were getting scratched. And finally they felt they were far enough away, and they stopped to catch their breath. And they looked at one another and said, "What was that? I can't believe, what was that? Who was that?" Man, their head and mind was spinning. They hurried on down the mountain, got back to the house, and that night at supper they told Grandpa what they'd seen. And Grandpa said, "Well, I forgot to tell you that during the winter, we found out that someone had built a shack up on Shadow Ledge. And it was a lumberjack. It's a lumberjack, and his name was Tim. He said some people called him Terrible Tim. He said this is why. When he'd go to town and he'd see people, he wouldn't speak to anyone. And if someone tried to speak to him and be polite and say hello, he would just kind of make a little growling noise and walk on. Everybody feared Terrible Tim. And it seemed like he spent all his time up on the mountain. But they said, you know what? Charlie opened up the package and said, "Well, Grandpa, where do you think this came from?" He said, "Well, I don't think Tim did it. I don't think he can do that kind of thing. I don't think he's really, a craftsman type guy. I'm not sure where it came from." Well, Charlie, Preston, and Red headed on to bed that night. And as they lay in bed, they began to think, well, what should we do? Well, Charlie was reminded of the devotion they had at supper time. It came back to his mind. He said, "You remember what Grandpa told us?" Because remember, every night after supper, Grandpa got his worn Bible out and he began to read. And that night he went back to Galatians chapter 6. And he told them about the seeds that we sow. He says, it's not that we just sow seeds in our heart, but we sow seeds in the hearts of others. And he says we do that with the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And how do we do that? We do that by our actions. Think about it. The first thing that people are going to see are our actions. And if our actions are pleasing to God, then that's a seed that is sown in the heart of someone that doesn't know Christ. And then it's going to be by the things we say, because our actions often are followed by what we say. And it says we say words that are encouraging, words that are kind, words that build up, words that encourage. We say the gospel, we speak the gospel of God's word and how he loves us. And he says we also sow seeds by how we worship. And what that means is people seeing that we're committed to Christ. That we're not committed to everything else around us, our job, our sports, our family even. We're committed to God first. He says that's how we sow seeds in the hearts. And Charlie was repeating that to Red and Preston. And he says, you know what we ought to do? That's what we need to do tomorrow. Red said, what do you mean we need to do tomorrow? He says, we need to go back to that mountain and sow a seed in the heart of Tim. Preston says, I've thought that through, and I don't think that's a good idea. Red said, now, I know it's not a good idea, and I'm not going. But Charlie says, guys, we've got to do that. We've got to take the gospel like we know it and see if we can plant it in the heart of Tim, because he needs Christ in his heart. He's lonely. He seems like he's mean and doesn't like anybody. He's angry about something. The boys began to think about that. I said, well, tell us, Charlie, what's your plan? Well, Charlie said, I've got a plan because this is what we can do. Sunday, on the way out of church, there's a little stand next to the door. And in that stand, there are some tracts. And how to know Christ, how to be a Christian. He says, we could take those tracts and take them up and leave them at his door. And maybe he would get them and read them. Who will go? Red said, Preston said, oh, boys thought it through. And finally they came around and said, okay, I'll go. Both of them chimed in. Their plan was set. As the boys went to sleep that night, none of them slept very well. They kind of just squirmed around. But finally, they dozed off to sleep. The next morning, that rooster was in the yard in the same place and gave out a call, and the boys woke up. But this time, they weren't going to tell Grandpa about their plan. They got all their chores done, and after the chores were done, they headed out toward the mountain. They went past the pond. They didn't stop and play this time with the frogs, but got to the tree line, and they looked up. They said, let's go. No trail, let's go straight ahead. And off they went up the mountain. They got closer and closer, and finally they made it to the path they had discovered the day before. And as they came to the path, they took the left and headed up towards Shadow Ledge. And there, the locust tree with the big trunk that branched off like this. Surprised, they saw another package. Another something wrapped in a bag, tied again. Preston got to it first this time and opens it up carefully. And as he opens it up, he finds a small carving out of wood of a beaver. And it had the beaver's fur and the beaver's tail and the beaver's two front teeth. It was a great looking carving. Somebody really knew what they were doing. And the boy said, hey, put that in your pocket. We got to go. We got to hurry. So the boys came up to the shack as they saw. They got closer and closer and closer. They were just out to the steps, and they took one step up, and it creaked a little bit. Boom! That door opened again. Standing in the door, filling up that door, in that same red and black shirt, with his jeans rolled up to his knees and his logging boots laced, was Terrible Tim. And he looked at the boys, and he kind of gave them a look like, I can't believe you're here. And he scolded them and said, get out of here. Don't you ever come back here again. If you come back here, I'm going... And before he could finish the sentence, off the boys went, headed back down the trail. And they hurried as fast as they could. This time they didn't waste any time. They didn't stop. They didn't stop even at the tree. They didn't stop at the path. They just made it all the way home, all the way back to the field, all the way back to the pond, all the way back to the gate. Finally stopped and took a breath. And they looked at one another and said, shh, I thought he was going, I don't know what he's going to do. We're not going back. Charlie, his head down, almost started crying. And they asked him, what's wrong? He says, we didn't do what we went to do. We went to witness to him, to share those tracts, and we didn't even leave them. Red said, let's just be thankful we got out of there. Preston said, and in the nick of time. Well, the boys found Grandpa out in the old pickup truck. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and each afternoon on a Wednesday, Grandpa would go to town and get any supplies. He says, boys, where have you been? The boys really didn't say anything, but they jumped in the back of the pickup truck. It was filled with some straw and some corn that was left over and a few old farm parts and a rope. And it smelled a little bit like diesel gas, like the old tractor. But they jumped in, and off they went to town. When they got to town, Grandpa went to the bank and the grocery store, the Piggly Wiggly that was there on the corner. Charlie, Preston, and Red went to the general store, and they walked in. And it was a big old oak door that swung with half glass and wood at the bottom with bells on the inside on the doorknob, and it rang and rang as they walked in. They walked across this worn old oak floor. fan going on the ceiling. And over there on the counter was lined probably about 30 jars with every type of 1-cent penny candy you could imagine. Next to that were big bags of flour and corn. Next to that was a big barrel of pickles, sour pickles. Heaped on the table nearby was a lot of cloth that a lot of ladies got and would make all types of clothes or things, curtains for their family. There was cans of every type lining the shelf. It was the place to come if you needed some supplies for your farm. And the boys walked around and were just amazed at all the stuff. All of a sudden, the door behind them jingled again. They turned, and they caught out of the corner of their eye a black and red flannel shirt moving into the doorway. And it was really a tall red and black flannel shirt. And as the head moved past the door, they could see it was Terrible Tim. As quickly as they could, they ducked behind the pickle barrel. They looked at one another. Do you think he saw us? They said to one another. They said, no, I don't think he saw us. So they quietly stayed there to watch what Terrible Tim was going to do. He comes over to the counter and kind of a scouring, rough, thundering whisper, he says to the clerk, show me your knives, please. The clerk reaches behind and looks in there, and he hands him a few knives. One is a Parker and Frost. The other is a Case. He had 2 or 3 types. Terrible Tim picked all of them up and looked at them, but one particular caught his eye. He opened it up, rubbed his thumb across the blade, grinned slightly and said, this one will do. And so he paid him $1.50, put it in a bag, and Terrible Tim walked out the door, not saying goodbye, not saying thank you, just walking out the door. The boys looked at one another and said, oh my goodness, what do you think he's going to do? Why do you think he bought that knife? You don't think he was doing that carving? And they all shook their heads and said, surely not, he can't. He wouldn't. The boys ran and they heard Grandpa outside honking the horn. They ran and jumped back into the truck, and off home they went. They got cleaned up that night because it was Wednesday. Remember, on Wednesday afternoon is the day that Grandpa would go shopping. Wednesday night was when they went to church and had fellowship dinner. And the pastor would speak to them. That night he spoke to them about the life of Paul. Paul in the Bible in the New Testament, a man that was a great witness for Christ. And he talked about how Paul had a great sense of the power of the gospel and what it could do in the lives of people. But Paul went through all types of things in his life as he witnessed. One time he was let down off the wall in a basket so he could escape those that were pursuing him. One time he was beaten and stoned and left for dead. Another time we find him in jail with another follower of Christ. Throughout his life, Paul was a witness, but also at the same time, he was persecuted, tempted, even left for dead. There's some characteristics, though, the pastor brought out about the life of Paul. He says, you know what? Paul was certain of this. He knew that in his life, he had to trust God completely. He knew in his life he had to keep his life according to the Word of God. He says he knew that there would be things that could grow in his life that would not glorify God, and those things were like weeds for a farmer. A farmer has an enemy, and one of those enemies is weeds that chokes things out. What would be a weed, he said? Maybe doubt. Maybe I'm not really sure if I'm really a Christian or not. I don't feel like a Christian today. I don't feel like I know Christ today. So doubt would come. He said maybe pride. Maybe I think I'm such a good Christian that it overcomes me, and I don't think I need God, that I've got it all together. Or maybe it's fear, the uncertainty of what's going to happen tomorrow or with my life. He shared how Paul worked through all those things in his life and continued to be a dramatic witness as he shared Christ with everyone. That night when the boys got home, they began to think and talk about their day. Charlie, reflecting upon how strong and how courageous Paul was, began to think that should be what we do. So before the boys went to bed and they turned the light out and looked up toward the mountain to see if the light was flickering again, Charlie said, "Guys, I've got an idea." And just as he said that, Red began to shake his head. "Oh no." Preston said, "What is it?" He says, "We've got to go back to Terrible Tim and witness and share and leave these tracks like we planned to." And they said, "Are you crazy? You've got to be crazy." He said, "No, we've got to do it. If we're going to be like Paul, if we're going to be faithful to God and be a witness, we need to do it." Each of them said, "Well, we'll talk about it in the morning." They all drifted off to sleep, except for Charlie as he looked back up on the mountain and saw the light. Yep, it was flickering as the wind blew gently the limbs, and finally it went out. The next morning, the boys did their chores, they played in the yard, and that afternoon, just after lunch, Charlie says, "What do y'all think? Let's go." Preston began to say, I don't. He says, "We need to do it. Terrible Tim doesn't know Christ. We have the opportunity. Let's do it." Red said, "Okay, I'll do it if Preston does it." Preston says, "I'll do it if Red does it." Well, they both decided they'd do it, so they were going to do it. So Charlie, Preston, and Red got together, got their tracks, and off up the mountain they went. They got about halfway up the mountain, not quite near the trail, the path that they'd been on the day before. And all of a sudden they hear in the distance, and they stop. Something they hadn't heard in the other 2 days. They stopped and they listened again. It was something moving in the dry leaves. And then as it would move, it would stop for a minute and it would make an unusual sound that kind of rattled a rat. They froze in their steps. They remembered they'd been warned about the rattlesnakes. All of a sudden they heard the sound of the rattlesnake rattling its tail. They began to back away slowly. Then when they saw a path that they could run down, that they'd come up the mountain, they began to run as quickly as they could away from that rattlesnake. Down the hill they went. But all of a sudden, they heard a cry. Charlie had stepped in a hole going down the mountain where a tree had been. And he had fallen forward. And he was crying and kind of screaming just lightly. The boys came up and said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" He said, "I stepped in this hole and I've twisted my foot. I've either broken my leg or twisted my ankle. I don't know what." And they began to try to help him. Red said, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Red was always kind of the reactive type. "What are we going to do?" Preston, having been trained in Boy Scout first aid, said, "Hey, let's immobilize it, elevate it, and let him rest." They didn't have any ice. So they leaned him back against a tree, elevated his leg a little bit, and began to think about, what can we do? Charlie says, "You got to do this. Grandpa knows this mountain like the back of his hand. You need to go get him." They said, "What about you staying here by us?" I said, "I'll be fine. Y'all go ahead." So off Preston and Red go down the mountain to find Grandpa. Charlie is kind of wincing in pain because his leg is kind of throbbing and the pain is going up his leg from what he had done to his ankle. As he lay there quietly, he began to pray and think and listen to the sounds of the woods, and all of a sudden he hears the leaves moving so quietly behind him. And then they move again quietly behind him. And then he hears the gentle and the leaves move again. As he turns and peers over his shoulder, tomorrow we'll find out the rest of the story. We'll see you tomorrow.